Hey, we are live. Yet another Ask Me Anything. There is Scott as well. We are going to go through your questions, both from the previous edition, because we didn't go through all of them, and those that you're typing live now. Scott, say hello.
Hello, hello. Good to see you all.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll iterate through offline and online questions. Let's start with offline. And what's the first one? Okay, here we go. No censorship. Everything goes. I'm putting every single question unless you say something really, really offensive. So what would be your approach on migrating away from a heavily AWS-centric serverless workloads, Lambda, to a more agnostic approach with Kubernetes? So let's say the word. Let's see whether we think the same. I'm going to count to three, and we say the tool, and let's see whether it's the same one. 1, 2, 3. Knative.
Knative.
You're too slow, man.
It's Knative functions specifically. The func CLI from the Knative project allows you to do basically the exact same UX as Lambda.
Yeah. So there's a exactly. I mean, like Lambda, right? I don't like when, in my head at least, serverless is not only functions, right? Serverless can be many different things. It's mostly about, I don't need to think about much about the infrastructure, about this and that. Here's the code, run it, right? In my head, that's serverless, right? And Knative can run almost anything, maybe not stateful applications, but almost anything. And then, as Scott said, if you want really Lambda-like, then we're talking about functions, right?
Exactly, and that's where they have this sub-project of functions under Knative. There also is like open function and things like that, but I don't recommend it personally. I think just go Knative with the func CLI. It uses build packs to build your images, so you don't need a Docker file. It has templates that you can get generated templates and just go ahead, and it's func create, and you just basically create and it deploys, and it's the easiest thing in the world to use. Once you have set up Knative on a Kubernetes cluster. So, yeah.
The only thing I will say is that it's not going to be as effortless as Lambda, right? I mean, actually, setting it up is relatively easy. Running it is easy. But when things go wrong, be prepared to understand well.
Typically. Exactly.
Say again?
You have to do what AWS typically do when you call them when something goes wrong.
Exactly. So be prepared for that. But other than that, yeah, that's. I don't think that you mentioned Open Function. Open Function is a wrapper around different projects, including Knative.
Exactly.
I don't think that there is even any decent alternative to Knative. Maybe what's the one that?
There's OpenFaaS from Alex Ellis.
OpenFaaS, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
OpenFaaS is great also. But just Knative kind of has become the de facto standard. The one real nice thing also that I would recommend looking at if you are doing functions in Lambda and you're doing a lot of like triggers, whether it's SQS or things like that, look at Trigger Mesh, which is open source, and you can basically get events from AWS into Knative eventing to automatically trigger your functions and things like that. It basically gives you the same functionality as you get in AWS, but works for AWS, Azure, Google, third-party services as well. It's called Trigger Mesh, and that integrates really well with Knative eventing in order to trigger your actual functions.
There we go. You heard it here. Okay, now the live question from Discord Routinet. How to version and release 15 Helm charts for dev, stage, prod, using AWS ECR and GitHub Actions. What's the best GitHub? Okay, let's do the first question first, and then we'll switch to the second and the third, right? And I'm just going to guess that there is a typo there, that you're not making different Helm charts for dev, stage, and prod, right? It's the same Helm chart that you have and that you customize by changing values in one environment or another. Hopefully, that's what you're doing, right? But outside of that, forget about GitHub Actions, right? So just kind of figure out a few shell commands, how to package Helm. What were the commands? Helm package to package it into basically a zip file, and Helm push exactly to push it to a registry. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about which registry, ECR or any other, right?
If it's ECR, you do have to pre-create the repository because they have to be unique in terms of being a registry. But beyond that, once you have the repository created, it's pretty simple. Same thing as any other one. Definitely, if you're in GitHub Actions, utilize the OIDC integration against AWS to simplify the authentication mechanisms. Don't put static credentials in like GitHub secrets. There are better ways of doing that. And when it comes to the versioning, I personally, there are different opinions in this. I personally am the fan of doing semver minus like RC or minus dev and then like a trailing number until it gets past staging. And then you basically, the only change you make is change the version because you don't want to deploy an RC version into prod, but you also don't want afterwards to have like a bunch of version 1.2.7 was never deployed to prod. I want to have that clear separation. So I like doing whatever the version I will be deploying to prod is minus dev dash 01, 02, 03, 04, whatever build it is along my way. When you make the decision to move from staging to prod, you do cut a new release of the Helm chart by pushing a new tag, but that push is literally just a YQ command or something on the chart.yaml, changing the version, just removing whatever that suffix is on the chart version.
Additional thing that I'm not sure how much others are doing it. I feel that they don't, but I always change the tag in values before pushing the chart, right? Because it should never be latest, and I think that the chart that I'm deploying should have a specific tag there. I can overwrite it if I want to, but it should be a specific tag of the image that is behind it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, what's the best GitOps repo structure for this? I feel that we were talking about it last time, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, we both agreed. You have a repository that represents an environment or environments. You split it into different directories, and you just have ArgoCD applications or Flux. Is it also application called? Anyways.
No, Flux is either a customization or a Helm release.
There we go, Helm release, true, right? And you just put there modified Flux or ArgoCD manifest to use a different chart, right?
Yeah.
And push it back.
Exactly.
And ECR repos be per environment, or is one sufficient? I feel that you answered that. For
the ECR repos, I do believe that they should be. Well, no, because I had talked about tags. Specifically around the repos, I believe that staging and dev can use the same one. Prod should always have its own because you are going to want to be much tighter on your permissions around the prod one. You're going to want to have probably more security enabled there, at an enforced level. So I would separate prod. I don't think you need to separate dev and staging. Why just pay for the extra storage of stuff? Pull from the same place.
The nice thing also about separating is that you can clean up much easier the non-prod releases, right? Because they're temporary. You don't really need them once you cut the production release.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go to one of the old ones. What is this? I'm working as a AWS cloud engineer with CDK and TypeScript mainly. Cool. How much do you see in the near future AI to impact cloud engineering sector? Shall I go first? You want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that it's not about AI. I think that AI is doing something that has been done for a very, very long time. And that's that we, throughout the history of this industry, we see a constant switch towards doing more complicated or different things, while easy things or things that become easy are kind of just easy, right? I remember, kind of writing HTML. That was complicated. And then we got tools with drag and drop, like Dreamweaver. Nobody understands that anymore, right? And that was impacting HTML developers, right? You couldn't be anymore an HTML developer only, because that's just very low skill that is easily replaceable. Then we got, and I'm skipping steps, right? We got Stack Overflow, which kind of, hey, if you need something easy that's been done thousands of times before by somebody else, you don't need to know it. You just Google it. You need to know how to distinguish good from bad solutions. And in my head, AI right now is a more convenient way to get the same result as Stack Overflow.
Yeah. So I think that AI has the potential of impacting in a very good way the cloud engineering sector. Yeah. And I am very worried that it is going to have a very negative impact on the cloud engineering sector, because too many people today are thinking that AI replaces brains, and that AI replaces the need to think, and that AI replaces the need for me to deep dive into technology and actually understand it. AI is good for the repetitive tasks that I have no energy to do, that I don't want to keep implementing the stupid functions and whatever, and just let it do the simple things for me, but it does not replace humans. We are far away from it being able to do that. We're reaching already the time in my mind of challenges where AI is being trained on AI generated content, which is a whole issue in and of itself. But so I'm hopeful that AI will be used in correct ways that will actually benefit us. But unfortunately, I'm also seeing a lot of signs where AI is being used in a detrimental manner, especially in the cloud engineering sector. It's being used in real weird ways that I think are bad.
I still feel that that's somehow similar to Stack Overflow.
It is. It's very similar to how people copy pasted things from Stack Overflow without understanding the code.
Exactly. And if you do that with AI, that might change in the future. Nobody knows what, but anytime soon, if you just accept what ChatGPT gives you, you are in deep trouble.
Right. Now, I will say, I do use GitHub Copilot on a daily basis. I will say, one of the number one things that I use it for is clone down a repo and do the explain. Copilot explain. And just explain to me what this function is. And that way I learned what it is from a general perspective. And then I go in and read it, right? Like, okay, awesome. Like, use this. I also use it to generate things to do. It's great. But people forget that there's that explain one. That's a good one because it explains to you what something is based off its knowledge, and now move on and actually write it yourself.
But even explain, you need to have the capacity to know whether the explanation is something you should take at face value or no.
Yes.
I've seen explanations that kind of, I look at it and oh, no, wait. Right. Stop there.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go next one. This is live from Guy Balmas. What are the most important design patterns and principles that DevOps must know in terms of Kubernetes and Kubernetes native applications? And I feel that there is a ton. I was about to say one, right? But there is, I think it's
X number of factors apps.
I mean, there is, I feel that two things in the order of kind of how people should learn is probably how resources are organized. The tree-like structure, that deployment creates a replica set, which creates pods, which happen to run containers. Understanding how everything is split into, it's almost like, to me, like microservice-like structure that somehow reminds me of Linux idea of having everything in small pieces. And that leads to understanding the idea of controllers, that actually there is a controller for every different type of resource or a group of resources that manages it. And once you understand it, probably the second thing I would go to, and I have 3 on my list. The second thing is understanding the life cycle of API in Kubernetes, right? That, hey, what happens when you submit a request? It's not kind of like, hey, here's apply this. There are quite a few things that Kubernetes API will do, right? Like it will trigger webhooks that many people don't know that they exist, right? And those webhooks might do nothing, might do something. We don't know. It might change what is being applied in Kubernetes cluster. It might reject it and so on and so forth. And once you grasp the life cycle of it, you probably should, at one moment or another, start thinking about, actually not at one moment, you should start thinking about custom resources, right? The moment you install ArgoCD, you are actually extending Kubernetes API with third-party extensions. And then Ep04, actually, not 3. And then you start thinking about, hey, how can I make Kubernetes home? And you make Kubernetes home by making it do what you want it to do, not only what comes out of the box or is installed through third party. And that's, you start thinking about creating your own CRDs and controllers. And that can be very easy or very hard. There are tons of ways how to do it. Won't go into it. But probably that would be the order I would be thinking about Kubernetes.
Yeah. So when I look at design patterns, I look at it very much like along the same lines, but a bit differently. The design patterns that I think are critical for understanding when we look at Kubernetes is number one, understanding event-driven systems, because that is how Kubernetes works. So we need to understand the distributed systems and event-based systems. We have to understand the Unix philosophy. Kubernetes follows the Unix philosophy of one thing that does one thing really well. You have a component called Kubernetes Scheduler. It is in charge of one thing, scheduling. You have a pod controller. All it does is control pods. You have another controller that manages replica sets. And all it does is manages replica sets. The idea of separation of concerns in the Kubernetes world is critical. And the final one I would say when it comes to like the Kubernetes, to the custom resources and all of that, especially if you're in like the cross-plane world or building your own controllers, critical API-driven design. So many people start from the implementation and then figure out what the API is going to be above that. No, you have to design around what that user interface is going to be, because I will say in the Kubernetes world, evolving APIs is not fun. Changing versions, conversion webhooks, all that, not fun. It's a necessity. Things need to change, but be API driven. If you understand the ideas of API driven design, separation of concerns, and distributed event driven systems, you can understand Kubernetes and go deep into it, and you will be able to figure out how to debug a system that's running on Kubernetes very efficiently.
And that event part that you mentioned, I think that's important, that Kubernetes API actually doesn't know how to do anything, right?
It knows how to write to etcd.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I mean, there is a bit more, but I mean, yeah, it fires webhooks and stuff like that. But the important part here is that Kubernetes API, when you apply something, will publish an event, say, hey, assuming that this is allowed to pass, kind of, hey, somebody published this. I don't know what to do with it. I couldn't care less. If there is a controller or 1,000 controllers or 0 controllers that will listen to those events of those specific resource types, not my problem. I couldn't care less. That's probably what you were referring to with event.
Exactly. Right. Driven. It literally sends it off. Yes. In this case, the event system is etcd and not, NATS or Kafka or something. Doesn't matter. It literally takes it, throws it into a queue. In our case, it's a database, but it throws it into a place. And other things are watching that place and saying, ooh, I see that a new deployment was created. I'm going to go and do my thing. And what does it do in the end? The replica set controller, again, it does nothing. It pushes an event back into the system saying, hi, replica set. And then pods go, ooh, replica set, ooh, pods, right? Like, it's very simple. Everyone is just publishing events except for very few controllers. pods, services, endpoints that actually have to program something, in the system. Many controllers in Kubernetes are meta controllers. They're metadata and event pushers.
And another thing, and I hear that very often in questions, indirectly in a way. And what I'm going to say is not 100% always true, but it's very important to let go of attempt to control the order of things, right? Oh, I need to create my pods need to attach a secret. I need to ensure that secret is created before the pod is created, right? And kind of just forget about it. It will, and again, this is not 100% true, but in many cases, it will just, eventually it will all work. You just throw it over there, and eventually the dependencies will be created, and the resources that depend on some other resources will say, oh, now I can do my job, right? So try to avoid to control.
Cases where that's not the case, that should be your starting point, and then escape out to ordering things. Don't have ordering be your default. Yeah.
Right. Okay. This is specifically for you. Question. YTT is YTT still the best tool for templating Kubernetes YAML resources, and how is going the process of killing Helm? And I will split that question into two sub-questions. Third-party Helm charts and your own Helm charts. I feel that split is important.
Yes. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what your preferences are, I'm not here to judge, even though I am judging. I do not like Helm to any extent of the word. And therefore, I wish that we could kill Helm, because I wish that it would be something that actually understands YAML and isn't just text templating. With that being the fact, Helm is going nowhere. Helm is here to stay, whether we like it or not. YTT, I believe, is still the best tool in my mind for advanced YAML templating. I think that in my mind, there's no question around it. People may prefer KCL syntax or a different syntax. YTT's strength and readability is, again, I mentioned KCL for a reason, because, only people that work at Upbound use it, but they really like it. No, KCL is great. So is Q. There's also Pickle for people that want to use Pickle, or whatever people want to use, as long as it's structure aware, great. I personally am a fan of YTT. However, anything that is going to be out there in the community, third party, things like that, has to be Helm, because that's just the de facto standard. So I use YTT internally a lot. I use YTT at different companies. But no, I do not see YTT replacing Helm. It still is one of my very, very proud moments when YTT won, and I made Victor deal with YTT for the rest of the series of You Choose. And I was able to beat Helm there. So yes, very proud of that moment. That's still one of the proudest moments of my career.
I would say that it's not about, I think that the fight or struggle is not whether it's YTT or Helm. I think that the struggle is in a way educational, and I'm talking now about first-party apps, your apps. And that education is that YAML, or JSON, which is the output that you need to pass to Kubernetes API. There is no way around it. Is structured data. And the only reasonable way to generate structured data is to use a language or a model or a template or whatever you want that is aware that it's working with the data. Yeah. And Helm is the only tool that I know of that is completely unaware that I'm using data. You could generate README files with Helm, it just does not care. It's completely unaware, and that's very painful. And whether that format to generate data that must be aware of structures is YTT or KCL or Q or whatever, to me, that's secondary importance. Kind of like,
Exactly.
we're going to talk about, in my head, we should talk about it once we first get to that first stage. We need to have structure-aware solution or solutions.
Yeah. Exactly. It could be customized as far as,
I mean,
structure aware. I'm not a fan of it, like for internal, for many reasons, but it could be for simple use cases, right? That is structure aware. Fine.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, this is a live question, and I don't understand it. I'm not sure what is NMNet. Do you know what is NMNet?
No. 2 networks and 3 clusters.
I mean, I understand most of it. I just have no idea what is NMNet. And it's okay to say, I have no idea. Okay, we don't know. Kishore.
Sorry.
Okay. And this is also from Kishore. If I use egress IP, pod can communicate it to core net but loses access to okay, still NMNet. No idea. Let's go next one. What are the most annoying problems you see DevOps, IT ops are battling in a day-to-day operations? No, sorry. I should have put it on a screen. Here we go. From Guy. What are the most annoying problems you see people are battling in a day-to-day operations? Apart from Helm.
Okay.
I'd like to split this because to me I'm going to make assumption, right, that there are, and many people call it DevOps, that are some kind of trying to serve others and create services that will be consumed by others, some kind of platform, something like that. And I think that their problems are very different from ops problems. People who simply take care of the system and are not really trying to expose that system to anybody else, right? Yeah. And I feel that those problems are very different, and tools are very different, and the ways how we accomplish things are very, very different, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to people trying to create services for others, I think that simply it's very the major problem. It's very hard because you cannot, if you want to expose something to others, you cannot just say, here you go, right? Look at all the events coming from Kubernetes cluster and figure it out, right? I think that Kubernetes is just too complicated, too complex in its current stage for other people that are not into it to use it. And creating that simplification, and this is where I feel that everybody's failing. Everybody's focused on day one operations. I can simplify. If you just change those few values in a Helm chart, you can have your application up and running. And I feel that that's the easy thing that everybody does. Because the hard thing is, what should you do when something doesn't work? Or how will you deduce whether it's working? How are you going to observe, and so on and so forth, right? And it's a very hard problem because simply it is, right? AWS and Google and Azure are solving that problem by pouring billions into it, right?
Yeah.
And for ops, I think that the major challenge for ops is that there is simply too much on their plate, right? If you simply, it's putting down the fires. And this goes into the first part of my answer, right? Ops very often are focused on putting down the fires rather than having enough time to make their lives easier or better.
Yeah. I would say the most annoying problem that DevOps need to deal with are other DevOps engineers, including themselves. We're all very annoying. There's nothing we can do about it. We're unique humans. But no, in all seriousness, I think that the biggest challenge or annoying problem that DevOps people have is when they deal with customers, let's call it, right? The internal customers of the tools that they're building. And they're like, how do you not understand that this resource creates these 17,000 resources and how everything works. The annoying part of them is there's this huge thing that I think that a lot of times, like the job of like a technical product manager within a company is the hardest job that exists on planet Earth, because you have to somehow be that bridge between the technical geek and the business side, right? DevOps have to be that same thing between the developers or their consumers and the operations team. That's the number one reason that DevOps failed, I think. 99% of companies say they do DevOps. 99% of companies do not do DevOps, is like something that I always say. And the reason is because DevOps is a cultural aspect, not just a set of technologies. And DevOps were supposed to be that bridge between operations and devs. They were supposed to be able to understand both languages and be that communication barrier to break down that issue. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening much in the industry. Hopefully, with platform engineering, we're going to make that better by taking the human out of the picture and making it automated. And then usually when we take humans out of things, it gets better. So hopefully that'll work here as well. When it comes to operations, I think the most annoying problem they have is the lack of respect that they get and lack of recognition that they get from within companies. I come from the traditional IT world of VMware, virtualization, networking, storage. IT are always at fault. Operations are always the ones to blame, even when it is the bad application, the application that's written bad that is crashing. It's always their fault, right? It's always IT. It's always their fault. I think the most annoying problem that they have is that, they are not given that recognition, and they are not given, therefore, the resources that other parts of the organization, DevOps, R&D, get in order to have the time to research, in order to look at new things. All of their time, they're low staffed, more than almost any other department in the IT world. Typically, not in all organizations, but typically, and they are the most overworked because they aren't viewed as a money generator, right? Because they aren't building the application that is making the company money. They just take money. And I think that it's very important in organizations, go and say thank you to the operations team when something goes right. Treat them well. Again, I'm not in that world anymore, but the number one annoying problem is just feeling like, yeah, we just did a major upgrade of all of our platforms to this, and no one cares. If no one cares about the work that you do, how happy are you going to be at work? Probably less than others.
Yeah, but that's up to degree on a much smaller level, similar to what you were saying earlier about DevOps. I think that it's really critical for every team to have a product person, right? Think of it like a startup, right? We need to figure out what people want. We need to make it, and we're going to fail 57 times until we do it. But once we do it, we're going to make sure, and this is the critical part, right? This is the last part. We need to not only do it, but make sure that people are aware of the benefits that they're getting through our solution. This is how every single startup works, or the bigger companies as well. And this is what is not working internally, right? Ops very often don't get recognition because, among other things, and I'm not now throwing them under the bus, right? Because almost nobody is aware of the good things that they did, right?
Exactly. I think that it's all around this challenge, right? But it's why in the platform engineering space versus DevOps, where we have the idea of platform as a product, right? A mentality that was really pushed forward by Pivotal originally, but is really taken off in the platform engineering space. This platform as a product ideology, methodology is critical, because platform as a product means you have a roadmap. It means you have a marketing strategy, how you market your internal developer platform internally within the company. These are critical elements, because that marketing not only gains usage, but it also gains recognition. And all those things come together, which is critical.
Okay, one from before, going back and forth. Would you consider using Kind running crossplane locally or on a job runner to bootstrap the first cluster? I would say that that's the second best option. No, or third. I'm not sure. First of all, you can get a control plane for free, one at Upbound, and that control plane can spin up others, including outside of Upbound, just to be 100% clear, right? But let me put it this way. You need somehow to create a Kubernetes cluster in any way you like, install Crossplane, and then instruct Crossplane to either manage the cluster you just created or to create a final cluster, whatever that will be. And if that's that should work. Except in AWS. Huh? That's the important part, because when you... what's the term? In AWS, there are quite a few resources that cannot be named. Non-deterministic names, right? So you need to be careful that when you create a cluster and you transfer Crossplane over there and you say, manage yourself from now on, you need to make sure that you update the external name of those resources. Otherwise, it would create a new cluster because it does not know how to find it. That's very specific to AWS.
Yeah. So this is actually something that I've been working on kind of on the side. And I got the idea coming from actually working on the Cluster API project. And in Cluster API, we have which is a declarative Kubernetes native way of managing Kubernetes clusters. And in Cluster API, we have a CLI tool called Cluster Cuddle. And what Cluster Cuddle has, it has a command called move. The traditional way that you install Cluster API is because it's that same issue. I need a management cluster with Cluster API to provision other clusters. Same issue that Crossplane has, right? It's the chicken and the egg. And the solution that they did was basically you install a kind cluster or whatever cluster you want, install Cluster API onto it, create a cluster. On that cluster, install Cluster API, and then there's a CLI command called cluster cuddle move. And what it does is basically export, import of the state. Now, what it does is it's a bit smarter. It pulls out the resource, it pauses the reconciliation on the source cluster using some Cluster API annotations. On the other cluster, it goes and applies it, resumes the reconciliation. Once everything is green, it goes and deletes it on the other side. And whatever. I'm basically building a solution similar to that with Crossplane, where basically you give it a configuration package and give it the manifest of what you want to deploy. And it would spin up a kind cluster, install the configuration, wait for everything to be ready, go apply the manifest, wait for the ready and sync conditions, pull all of the managed resources, all of that out, install Crossplane, whatever, and then, install, and there would be just whatever has to be in that cluster. You have to have Crossplane installed, right?
Less elaborated solution can be also install Velero in both.
Exactly, backup restore. Exactly, right? Like, again, and that way it works for AWS as well, because as long as you're doing export, import, or you're doing that and not just GitOps apply, the Crossplane does add automatically that annotation of the managed external name onto the resources. So whether you're using Velero or like an export import, that would work. The reason I'm doing it from a CLI is because I don't want to have the dependency on like an S3 bucket or something like that for Velero.
Okay, Scott, can you explain how to configure SDN networking in Kubernetes using specific solution like ArgoCD and stuff like that? I'm not sure that can be explained in words.
So again, there's multiple levels to this. Typically, and as I've always said, and I will say it again, use a packaged solution of Kubernetes and don't go the DIY approach. That can be an open source distribution. That could be a commercial distribution. That could be a public cloud managed service. That could be on-premise, whatever. That's a Tanzu, OpenShift, Rancher, Spectro Cloud, whatever you choose. Like, I'm not here to say which one is best or anything like that, even though I have opinions. Most of those come with an SDN solution built into them. So there's not really much to do in terms of the install. If you are doing a do-it-yourself, or for some reason your distribution doesn't come with one, Helm install Cilium, Helm install Calico, Helm install Antria, Helm install whatever, and follow their documentation. Typically, if they have an operator, you're going to Helm install the operator and then do a CRD that installs that operator. But, that's up to you.
The only thing I will say about solutions like Cilium, do your best to install it as a first thing, right?
Yeah, always.
If you want to change from
with GitOps, by the way, you never install it with GitOps. You
No.
later adopt it into GitOps. You do not want to deploy your GitOps controller without a CNI.
Yeah, not only that, but also actually it goes a bit earlier. Let's say that you're using EKS. Same thing goes for Google Cloud or for Azure.
Yeah.
You cannot just create a cluster. Clusters usually have to have special parameters and they differ from, I'm talking about Cilium now, right?
Yeah.
You need to read instructions how to create a cluster that is ready for, let's say, Cilium, right? It cannot be just, hey, EKS Cattle, EKS control, create a cluster, and then I'm going to install Cilium. That will not work.
Right. Now, what I will say specifically, because it's how to configure SDN networking, I use Cilium a lot less than Victor does, and therefore I don't have much to add there. In terms of Calico, I do have two recommendations. Number one, please use the Kubernetes backend and don't use bare etcd. Use the KDD backend. Much better. Do not use an external etcd. Don't do that to yourself.
No.
It's horrifying to manage, so just don't. Number two, if you reach large scale and you need route reflectors, all that stuff, use Taifa. It's already default, but make sure to use that because I've seen organizations that don't use Taifa and then it becomes a nightmare. And the third one is to install Calico in the manner where you can do CRDs to manage everything. Traditionally with Calico, you had to use Calico CTL in order to apply certain settings. There is now a way to install Calico that it basically installs another API server and you just apply them as CRDs to your cluster and don't need to use Calico Cuddle anymore on the nodes. So do that. Set up the API server so that you can manage everything in terms of that day two configurations via Kubernetes APIs. Do not use the CLIs for this type of stuff, talking to a separate API. Talk to Kubernetes API. If the backend configuration takes a Kubernetes CRD and applies it to another API server and stores in some external database, that's not your issue. You work Kubernetes. So work Kubernetes. That would be my 2 points on that. Yeah.
Okay. By the way, do the stuff that you normally do in YouTube. Subscribe and join the channel. Give a coffee a month. Anyways, question from before. Buy Bad Blood for ArgoCD. And I feel that both me and Scott have negative things about ArgoCD, but from very, very different perspective. I recommend using ArgoCD over Flux, mostly because of the adoption and the activity in the project and so on and so forth. But there are things that I don't like about ArgoCD, which are not necessarily much better in Flux. And you can characterize that as Bad Blood. Like the example that annoys the hell out of me, for example, is having to use sync waves, right? Which is just bad, but okay.
Which you don't in Flux.
There we go. Now, one thing I do like more about ArgoCD is that it doesn't support Helm natively. I think that it converts everything into YAML that allows it to track things better. But I'll let now Scott say. So I prefer ArgoCD, and then I have negative things about it because I have negative things to say about every single thing on this planet. But Scott prefers Flux. So
why the bad blood for ArgoCD? Very simple. There are a few things that I really despise about it. Number one, it is a tool that was built natively for Kubernetes, and therefore, because it's not a tool that was later adopted to Kubernetes, it was built for Kubernetes. So managing permissions in a config map or a secret using a CSV file is not legitimate in my mind. Any tool in the Kubernetes world that does not use Kubernetes RBAC or even a custom CRD, but decide that it is legitimate to have a config map. I had the same screaming about EKS for years until they finally created the CRD mechanism instead of the auth config map. And there's now a CRD way of doing that as well. I have an issue with Kubernetes tooling that does not work in a Kubernetes way. So that is a fundamental pain that it causes me anytime that I look at ArgoCD. That also had in the past very big security implications that opened up. There's a great video where it goes through all of these security issues that were basically without permissions you can get root on the cluster because of this config map. That's been fixed, right? I'm not saying that it's insecure today. I'm saying that, but when you work in non-logical manners, non-logical things will happen. That's number one. Number two, its main selling point has purely been the fact that it has a UI, and that's why it succeeded over Flux. I have an issue with that. And my issue with that is not that I am against UIs. I work a lot with Backstage. I worked previously with the whole vRealizer Aria suite from VMware. I like UIs. But a tool should be picked from the technical perspective of how you actually use it on a day-to-day basis. And people with Kubernetes use the CLI and use APIs and use Git, and that is the main interface. The fact that there's a UI that's great for demos, it sells great to the CTOs, clicky in the UI, it looks great. But in the end, as DevOps practitioners who are actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, we use the CLI more, we use IDE plugins, we use APIs. Therefore, by the way, Flux does also have a few different UIs that you could choose from. But UIs should not be the reason you choose a tool. You should choose based off the technology. I, unlike Victor, believe that one of the detriments of ArgoCD is that it doesn't handle Helm charts natively, and it handles them like, Helm template. And I'll explain why very clearly. And again, I do not believe that internal apps should be written as Helm, and therefore you don't have that issue with internal apps. But third-party applications, because we are in the world where Helm is a standard. That is the reality. And the reality is that Helm template breaks many things in the Helm world in some more advanced charts that exist out there of the third-party Helm charts.
That's true.
That is why, because I believe that Helm should only be used for third-party applications, and I do not want to need to reverse engineer what someone has done in their Helm chart to make it work in ArgoCD, I have an issue with that. I believe that there should be a field in the Helm release of Flux, or in the app when you use Helm in whatever, of dangerous only should be used for third-party applications, never used for internal applications equals true in order to deploy a Helm chart. However, once you deploy a Helm chart, I believe it should be doing Helm install, because that is the desire of the company that built it. That's how it has for sure been tested. That's how it was developed. No one develops through Argo. Everyone develops Helm install. Therefore, it should be Helm install. And that is where Flux does a much better job.
That's true. I still think that those things shouldn't be done in Helm, but in reality is that they are.
We also both agree that Helm shouldn't exist, but Helm does exist. And therefore,
Okay. Live one from Mr. Kake, I think, probably. Who knows? Do you have any good pattern to import existing infra to Terraform? Now, this is contradictory with the rest, I think. I have, what does it say? I have a legacy system that I would like to manage with GitOps. And I don't think that Terraform can be used. It can, but should be used for GitOps. And I'll give you two reasons. First, many people, when they say GitOps, they think that they forget about the 4 principles of GitOps. And we can now discuss whether those are good ones or no. But one of the principles is that it is a pool-based model. Whether that's a good thing or not, that's a separate discussion, right? It's a pool-based model. So if anybody thinks that kind of GitOps is, I have GitHub Actions that will, execute this or that, not GitOps.
Right.
For good or bad, right? And the second thing is that GitOps, this is not necessarily one of the principles, but more of GitOps, but Kubernetes itself is that what we spoke earlier about that splitting it into individual resources and managing life cycle of each resources. With Terraform, you have one project, right? It's a one blob. If you try to put that in Kubernetes, it does not work, right? The reconciliation constant with all those operators doesn't work, right? So, and everybody can now say that I'm biased because I'm working on crossplane. Yes, I'm biased. Still, my bias says don't put it in Kubernetes. There's nothing wrong in using Terraform. Just to be 100% clear, I'm just saying don't associate it with GitOps. Don't put it into Kubernetes. And because the only way how you can do GitOps today is through Kubernetes.
No,
no,
that's not true. No. With Terraform Cloud, there is a pull-based mechanism with its SCM integration that it can pull from Git, and it goes and installs the Terraform. And then it also has drift detection now for certain providers, for example, AWS, where it can run drift detection and then apply Terraform again in order to make the change. So there are ways of doing it with Terraform Cloud. There are ways of doing it with Gruntworks' SaaS solution. I think Gruntworks or one of the other ones that works with OpenTofu now also has that. I'm just less aware of them. But Terraform Cloud, you can do GitOps. It technically does solve all four of the patterns.
I stand corrected then.
The one thing I would say is for importing existing infra to Terraform, yes, there are challenges around this. There are tools, depending on if it's all AWS. There is like a open source tool from AWS that helps you do that. The other thing that I would recommend, though, if you're looking at a wider array of things or different clouds, there is a what's that company? Firefly. Firefly is a company that have a solution that basically looks at your cloud and can basically take it and generate the infrastructure as code for you, including all of the import commands to automatically ingest that into Terraform or other languages.
Now we're coming finally to answering the question. I'm very much against that. And this is nothing to do with Terraform. I think I'm very much against that for Terraform. I'm very much against that for Crossplane. I'm very much against that for Ansible or any similar tool. And the reason why I'm against it is that, so you have a system that is already created somehow, right? You have thousands of resources, right? And yes, if you just pull that into the format of a tool you use, let's say Terraform, right? That's not it, right? You still need to organize it meaningfully depending on the tool. In case of Terraform, you need to create projects, right? You need to somehow group those resources into things that are meaningful. Just pooling and transforming existing resources into the code of whichever tool you choose is doable, but should only be used as maybe the starting point to start reorganizing it in a way that the tool says that you should be reorganizing, right? Just pooling and transforming, that simply does not work. Unless that's a first step towards you organizing a thing in a Terraform proper way.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What next? From before, Flux does not support SOPs in their Helm manager, which means any Helm chart with secrets has to have a separate customization using SOPs. I find it easier to use ESOs plus SOPs plus Terraform. Oh boy. Now this is the part where me and Scott disagree, but we might agree at the end. I prefer ESO. He, I believe, prefers SOPs. He will correct me. What I'm not sure is
over sealed secrets. I prefer ESO always.
Cool. Then we're in agreement.
Our debate is sealed secrets versus SOPs, which never is the solution. But if it is the requirement to not have an external secret store, I prefer SOPs over sealed secrets.
Okay, fair. That's fair enough. But here's my question. I'm not sure, unless we have some special cases, why would somebody combine ESO with SOPs? right? Kind of, I understand why you might want to use SOPs instead of ESO. I'm not sure why you would use both of them at the same time. And I'm going to ignore the Terraform, which I think that you should put it in Kubernetes way, whatever, even Helm chart. But why? Yeah. Do you think that can you come up with a reason why ESO plus SOPs?
ESO and SOPs. I don't see the use case for those two together.
Okay, then there you go. What else? Let's see one of the live questions. We use it. Hi, I'm from Serbia. Oh, thank you, BV. How do you manage? Okay, how do you manage many environments in Terraform? Is Terragrant only one solution? I don't use Terraform. I don't run, so I cannot answer that anymore. Craig?
You can use Terraform Workspaces if you're using Terraform Cloud. I do not recommend Workspaces when you're running on the open source, the BSL licensed things, or OpenTofu, the open source things. I can't say open source about Terraform. I apologize for lying. But yeah, so you can with Terraform Cloud. When you're not with Terraform Cloud, then unfortunately, I would say Terragrunt is a acceptable solution, although I'm personally not a fan of it. I don't like wrapper tools from other vendors around other tools that add their own uniqueness above the languages and then start messing with it. And then you lose out on certain features because they only work with specific features of the lower language and they have to upgrade their dependent. It just creates a whole mess sometimes. I'm not a fan of Terragrunt, although it does solve serious issues. If you're using Terraform, I recommend using Terraform Cloud and then use Terraform Cloud Workspaces is the way to manage multiple environments.
What do we recommend to increase a vendor-neutral Kubernetes open source project visibility? I have only one. That's donated to CNCF.
So it's either donate to CNCF, find friends who have different podcasts, whether it's like the cloud native, CNCF ones themselves, or any of like the podcast ones, and get out there and do like the, what's new with, or new project in the echo, Find someone that is influential that has those podcasts and try and get on there and share it. Share it in the Kubernetes channels that are relevant. One of the biggest things that I've always said is that people in the Kubernetes world will respect you if you also help other people. If you are someone that is known in the community as someone that's helping out, that's doing this, that's sharing beneficial information, whether it's on X/Twitter/ whatever people call it today, or on LinkedIn or whatever it is, if you post about this new tool, it will get traction because people will be following you. You will get that community vibe that Kubernetes really does have. But that will only happen if you are involved in the community. So number one, get involved in the community. But yes, to reach meteoric levels, you have to be part of a foundation and not managed by yourself, because people have been stung too much from the past 2 years of what different vendors have done with changing licensing. That for good or for bad, I'm not judging any of those decisions. Some of them I agreed with, some of them I didn't, but doesn't matter. People changing the licensing has affected the industry, and people are worrisome to use open source tools that are, or to rely on open source tools that are vendor driven or person driven and not foundation driven.
Even if you ignore the licensing issues, which are big, I believe, warrants separate discussion, I feel that majority of people are overwhelmed by CNCF, right? And CNCF is mostly Kubernetes. And now if people are overwhelmed with CNCF and that's a go-to place for Kubernetes, then very few are going to go outside of CNCF. I'm already overwhelmed, kind of like, this is already too much for me. And as a result, it's very hard to promote something outside CNCF. Unless you, what Scott said, unless you actually manage somehow to convince people in podcasts or, to talk about it. But even they are overwhelmed, right? Kind of if you go to Brett Fisher, right? He's a friend, right?
Yeah.
He might not be talking about it simply because we're all bombed with, okay, he has probably 50 things on his list already, right? And then being in CNCF helps a lot to kind of convince even people to talk about it.
Right.
Okay. How do we study and keep up to date? I feel that there are two separate issues. And then how do we debug any issues and what tools do we use to do it? In my case, studying is, two things. First, I'm a couple of things actually. Making sure that I have enough time to learn about new things, not just do stuff, right? Because if I just do stuff, then I will not find out whether there are more efficient ways to do stuff, right? Kind of studying is a way how we can become more efficient and actually generate more free time to study even more, right? And I try to study or things that are somehow related with what I do outside study. And this is, I feel, important. I don't discriminate projects, meaning that I will pick up, when I have time, I will pick up a tool. I know nothing about it. I don't know whether it is solving the problem that I have, but I'm still going to go through it. Maybe I will not spend more than a couple of hours, maybe only an hour, kind of, but just I'm picking random tools because I don't know what I don't know, right? I cannot choose the things to study only that will help me in what I do because I don't know.
Right. So for me, there's a few ways that I do this. Number one is join a bunch of different Slack workspaces, the CNCF workspace, the Kubernetes workspace. Scroll through the channels and add yourself to, even if you just know what one tool is, but add yourself to that channel. What does it matter that you have 20 channels, that you don't read the messages all the time, and that you have messages just hanging out there? Doesn't matter. But the fact that you have these channels, and then over time, just go into them and scroll through the messages from the last month. It takes 2 minutes. You scroll through 2 months of messages, and you just see, because things will pop out at your eyes of, ooh, there was a new release of X. Okay. Oh, wow. Like, I'm seeing a bunch of issues. Oh, I'm seeing a bunch of, comments on this. Like, ooh, let's see. Maybe that's something interesting, right? So in the Kubernetes world, to stay up to date, the Kubernetes Slack, #1 place to do that, I think. To find new projects, look at the diffs in the, whatever. You can look at the CNCF repositories of, what new projects have been added. I always like to look at the new projects of the week or of the month and, just see, okay, what is being introduced now? Because it does require a certain level of adoption in order to join the CNCF. So that means, okay, there's at least some adoption of this. What does it do? Like, what is it actually trying to solve? That's number 2. Number 3 is listen to a bunch of podcasts at 2x speed. Now, I specifically say 2x speed because no one has the time to listen on 1x speed. But even if you only pick up 50% of the words on that, that's perfectly fine. Because what you will pick up from that is, okay, is this something that interests me or not? No one is learning from typical podcasts of the 40-minute show on what's new with Kyverno, okay? No one is learning a huge amount from that. But when you do listen to those sessions, which I do, right, for example, and you listen to that and all of a sudden you hear something that interests you, great, go to the docs and learn about that. Go to the release notes, go try it out, right? You're not actually learning from this. You're using the podcast as that trigger where you're going to hear that one sentence that's like, ooh, and then you go and check it out, right? That I think is key. And the one final thing, look at what the vendors are releasing. Because the vendors, look at the beta and alpha things that like vendors are releasing, right? This is where you see where the industry is going. You go and see like the cool projects or like AWS Labs, right? VMware Tanzu Labs, Red Hat's, disparate organizations like Janus IDP and whatever that, they create their own organizations. But like many companies have like their labs org where they have like these cool projects that are being created on. In the end, the projects that work are the ones that have money that are being backed by companies that can pay engineers to work on it full time and actually develop them well. So go look at what they're doing in their labs projects, because that means that there's at least some investment from a large vendor that maybe this is something good. So you can find cool ideas that way. Yeah.
What? Oh, I already forgot. I was about to say something, but I forgot. That doesn't matter. It's all good. You have the answer. We are 5 minutes over. Okay, like always, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pick up all the questions that are left unanswered in today's session, and we are going to answer them next week, right? So just go back and forth like we did so far, and see you all next week. Thank you for coming. Have a good New Year or Christmas, or what's the name in
Happy Hanukkah. Happy
Hanukkah,
holidays.
exactly. All of those. There we go.
Happy
Cheers,
holidays
everybody.
to everyone. Wishing everyone all the best.